Just to be real focused. We good? Thus far in the Gita, there's been a primary teaching. Two primary teachings have occurred. What's the first primary teaching thus far in the Gita? Leela? You're not the body. All right. And in Sanskrit, that would be called what? Sankhya. All right. Winner. Okay. You're not the body. There's a difference between spirit and matter. You are a soul. You have a body. There's a distinction between consciousness and the inert matter that consciousness is able to manipulate in this world, like this chair versus me, between your body and you. That's the first teaching. That teaching is cognitive. It's a theory. It's an idea about the nature of the world. It's a thought. And usually when you talk about cognition, it's then coupled with another word. What's the other word that goes along with cognition? That goes along with cognitive, yes? Behavior. So there's a cognitive component, the idea that you're not the body, and then there's a behavioral component. And the behavioral component is what? The other primary teaching thus far in the Gita. What is it? Yes?
To do your duty without attachment.
You do your duty without attachment to the results. And so the idea, the cognitive idea, informs your behavior. Because you know you're not the body, you're less attached to this world. Are there other ways to do your duty without being attached to this world besides believing in a spiritual concept like the idea that you're not the body? You're nodding your head. What are they? Are you nodding your head like I'm following you, or are you nodding your head like you're answering my question? Don't do that. When I ask you a question, you nod your head, it indicates to me that you're saying yes to my question. Like if I go, would you like a glass of water? And you go, sorry. And I go, you want a glass? You go, no, I was just indicating I follow what you're saying. It gets confusing. At that moment, everybody stopped nodding their head except for you, which meant everybody else wasn't sure. You guys remember the question? What was the question? Varangi?
Can you actually be or act in that consciousness of like not being attached to the result without believing in something higher or believing in spirituality?
That you're not the body, yeah. And so what's the answer to my question?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. How come? Give me an example.
You could just be a secular or stoic person.
You could just decide, geez, there's a lot of variables in life I can't control for. The only thing I can control for is I do my duty. I cannot affect the outcome. I'm not going to be stressed about the outcome. However, I don't believe in anything beyond this physical world. Therefore, I'm a secular stoic. I'm an atheist who's also detached. So the idea that you're not the body and that then results in you acting in this world without being attached. What's your name? Sean, do me a favor, move over this way just a little bit because you're right behind this thing. I'm having to do this to like make eye contact. And it won't take much. Just like give me like whatever it is, 6 inches. We're solid. Thank you, man. Don't be sorry. I'm sorry. It's like there's just one of you. Okay, do you guys follow that? So you could get to the place where you decide, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in consciousness to be irreducible. I believe it's caused merely by chemical states. I don't believe in anything other than the physical world around me, but I'm still a stoic. You could get there. So it's not necessarily that the only way to get to the behavioral ingredient is through the cognitive element. You could get to the behavioral component through another method. For example, I can say, hey, let's get on the 405 and then we'll get to LA. Right? So that's a method. It's, let's say, the cleanest method to get to Los Angeles from Laguna Beach. But there are other ways to get to LA besides the 405. You could obviously take the 5, be an option. That would be one option. You could potentially take a helicopter or even a plane. It'd be really stupid, but they might even have planes that fly out of John Wayne and then stop in LAX. It's possible. For sure, you could take a plane from John Wayne to Phoenix, catch a connecting flight in Phoenix, and then go to LA. So you could take a boat, you could walk, you could take surface streets. There's any number of ways you could get to Los Angeles from here. But the 405 to LA is a super clean path. It makes a lot of sense, and it's good. Could you realize you're not the body and still act in an attached way in this world? Maybe. I'm a little less certain about that. Because if you really knew you weren't the body, then that would have to affect the way you operate in the world. And to really be a Stoic, you might have to know that you're not the body and there's something else. So we could argue it, but I don't want to. I want to acknowledge that there might be other ways to get to the behavioral component than the cognitive component. But with that nuance, and the reason I'm mentioning that nuance is why. None of you will have the answer, but you should try. What?
That up to this point, the Gita is pre-theistic.
That's true, but not pre-theistic in the sense of unspiritual. The first teaching of the Gita is a spiritual teaching, you're not the body. So it might be pre-theistic, but it's still spiritual. So that point doesn't work. Why am I laboring on this extremely nuanced point? When almost all the time I teach, you're not the body, therefore act in a detached way, and I show that they fit together really nicely. Why would I break from that? Yeah.
Is Krishna starting in this chapter?
No. I'm breaking from that just to get you guys thinking more creatively and more rigorously. It's easy to assume logical connections that may be possibilities but are not absolutely required. And when you want to really deeply look at a text or a teaching or an idea or a piece of legislation, if you want to really deeply look at anything, you have to not assume all the stuff you normally assume when you look at something, to do a little bit of a shorthand and do the autocomplete in your mind and just fill in the blank. Do you ever get that thing on social media where it says, can you read this? And if you can, you're a genius. And it's a bunch of words. Each word is jumbled up. You ever seen that? And then you can read it and you think you're smart. You're not smart. Every single person can read that. You're actually dumb because you believe the stupid comment they made that you're special if you can read that. And that's how they pandered to your ego, because you're so dumb that they can write something which is totally untrue like that. And you're such a sucker that you'll never bother researching it. The truth is, human beings don't read letters. Human beings look at whole words and groups of words, and they can effortlessly sort out the letters in the proper order because our brains recognize patterns and groups of things and then fix them and clean them up. That's why we get caught in optical illusions and things like that, because our brain can't just perceive the world at every moment tabula rasa, like a blank slate, reinventing the wheel at every moment. Rather, we learn patterns and we view the world through those patterns as a shorthand, as a cognitive shorthand, as a mental shorthand. The process of thinking rigorously means you stop doing that. And you look at things and you do reinvent the wheel. And you slowly and methodically think through things without a bunch of unnecessary assumptions. Unplug the water thing. Do you guys follow that? So I want us to do that today, which is why I've introduced this concept as a bit of a spanner in the works for you guys. Because usually I say you're not the body, and what does that lead to?
Yoga.
Which is?
Do your duty without attached.
Bingo. If you're going to do that task, you have to have an idea before that. What's the idea?
That you're not the body.
I normally do it like this, right? Sankhya Yoga. cognitive behavioral. But I'm breaking from that model today. And I'm using an example. Think about it creatively. Could you be a secular Stoic? Yes, you could. Could you be a spiritualist who never acts on their spiritual belief system? Yes, you could be. Because I want you guys to get used to this idea of not just learning, like I taught you last week, to memorize it, just A to B. A plus B equals C, right? I taught you guys almost like a school teacher would teach you mathematical tables. And because I have a better memory than y'all, I remembered what I taught you last week, and now I'm giving you a more nuanced version, which is that in general, you need to learn your math tables. In general, you need to learn your multiplication table, But, and philosophy also has that component where you have to learn certain things. Modus tollens and modus ponens and, different fallacies so that you can spot them. But once you learn that system, just like with music, once you learn notes and scales, you can then fudge them slightly in various ways that sound really cool. Like with percussion, once you learn to play in time, like the mridanga for instance, then sometimes you can play a little bit off. You can lag just a little bit and hit just a little bit after the beat and it sounds good. And if you don't know what you're doing and you're off time, it sounds bad. But if you know what you're doing and you slide it in just a little bit, like an eighth of a note or a 16th of a note too late, it becomes really tasty because you just got that little bit of groove, a little savoir-faire type thing, and you're just a little bit, you're on it so good that you can play around it, and it demonstrates your proficiency. It demonstrates your prowess, and it's in many ways the sign of a musician who's truly a master at his instrument. Right, Pavan? Yeah. You know what I'm talking about. You see it all the time amongst really good players. And then players can actually, they do it together because they're so good, you can do it with your friends. And they'll play a little off, and then you'll see them, and you'll play a little off, and then there's a little bit of a jam thing that goes on where you look at each other and you dial it in, and you get it just right. Sometimes if you're playing for a singer who's not so accomplished, he won't even quite know what you're doing. It's almost like he doesn't even know what you're doing. You're carrying the kirtan more than he's carrying the kirtan. He's just along for the ride, right? Even though he's a singer. So once you learn the system, you then have to a little bit learn how to exploit the system and not get bound by the system and be a little fluid and be able to think outside the box. So because we're going in a spiritual text, everything gets based on a spiritual idea, which naturally leads to detachment. There may be a limit to how detached you can become as an atheist, but it's not that there's no possibility of stoicism. There's no possibility of detached action. There's no possibility of duty, which is why sometimes Krishna will say, if you don't believe any of this, at least you can do your duty. At least you should be happy that an opportunity to perform your duty has come about. Or if you don't believe in the soul, then what are you worried about? There's no afterlife, so what does it matter? Let's just win some glory and not worry about it so much. He'll make occasionally arguments like that. They're not actually in line with what he is presenting, but he's just showing how even from a number of different angles you can get to the same point. And he's making a very, very strong argument. Did you guys follow that? Great. So thus far in the Gita we've learned two things. And they're connected. And one leads to another. What's the first one? Somebody who hasn't spoken yet?
Not the body.
You're not the body. Excellent. And what's that called in Sanskrit, hidden? It's called Sankhya. You're not the body as an instance of a much larger point. What's the much larger point, Dom? The macrocosmic point.
The macrocosm point?
I don't know why you're repeating what I said.
I don't know.
You space out?
I don't know what the answer is.
Okay, fair enough. What's the macrocosmic point? Somebody. You're not the body is an instance of a larger point. Hidden.
Spirit and matter.
That's right. You, being a soul and having a body, is an instance of a much larger point. The much larger point being that there is spirit and matter. I just exposed another flaw in your thinking. Sean, of course, gets an A. You knuckleheads, your name's Sean, right? You knuckleheads don't get an A because he just got here and he's answering questions right. You guys have been here forever. You're getting old and gray here and you still don't know the answer. A friend of a friend used to teach this thing called Sky Academy with the guitar. His name was Uli John Roth. He was a guitarist for the Scorpions. He's a super aficionado. He used to play the Jimi Hendrix tour where he was, like a Jimi Hendrix type guitar player, owned Jimi Hendrix's guitars. He used to date Jimi Hendrix's girlfriend. And he was like a very, very, he's still alive, very, very advanced, virtuoso guitar player. He would teach these Sky Academies where all of these unbelievable shredders from LA would come to learn from him. He was a German. He'd fly over and teach them. And the first thing he had to play for him, and they'd all be trying to impress him with just like, million miles a minute guitar playing. And then he would say to them, oh yeah, play that same thing, but slow it down to 1/10 the speed. And when they tried to play the same scales, super slow, but still keeping perfect time, they would fail. Then he would copy the scales they played, play them insanely slow, faster than they could, and like everything in between, on the spot copying their favorite licks, demonstrating that he was the guru and they were all the students. You follow? If we're going to think creatively, we have to notice things like, well, wait a second, spirit and matter, what's our most elegant evidence of distinction between spirit and matter? What's the most elegant instance of this general principle that there's spirit and matter? Madan?
Consciousness.
Huh?
There's consciousness.
I don't know what that means. It's not an answer to my question. What's the most elegant instance of spirit and matter that we have access to?
The soul in a body.
Bingo. So that's an instance. But that instance isn't a standalone. It reminds us or it awakens us or it makes us think about a much larger principle. Namely that there's consciousness and matter, which allows us to have respect for all other beings, not to view the world solipsistically as if we're the only conscious being in the world, but to see that other beings are conscious as well, to value other forms of life, and so on and so forth. So we got to be able to look at an instance and the larger principle. We got to be able to look at logical connections, but see if they're not automatic or necessary and there's other ways to get to the same point. Are you starting to think more broadly? Thus far, Krishna's taught that you're not the body, which is an instance of a larger principle. What's the larger principle, Pavan?
The principle of spirit and matter.
Bingo. And what's that called, Narayan? Sankhya. 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 Sankhya leads to what, Diana? Sanskrit word.
Yoga.
Bingo. Yoga. If you're going to put an adjective in front of the word yoga, what's the adjective? Buddhi. Buddhi means enlightened. Yoga means, in this sense, practice. And now you have a behavioral practice. And Buddhi yoga or yoga in English would be stated simply in the sentence as what, Dalen?
Enlightenment.
No. Buddhi would be enlightenment. Buddhi yoga as a cognitive consequence of the idea that you're not the body in English would be stated simply in an English sentence as what? Howard? Yeah, but that's not enough. That is true. How is it framed in the Gita? Yes.
Doing your duty but being detached from the results.
Doing your duty but not being attached. You should be ashamed of yourself, Howard. And you should actually feel like the village idiot over there, Dalen. How many times have we said, do your duty, don't be attached? A gazillion times. Therefore, when I'm leaning into that question, you guys should immediately know the answer. What is yoga? In the second chapter of the Gita. Practice. What practice specifically? I'm asking for it in English. Yeah, the term's Buddhi Yoga. Yeah, don't say it like a question. Say it like an answer, and don't make me ask you 3 times when I just gave you the answer less than 10 seconds ago. It's discouraging as a teacher to give the answer and then ask a student the question you just gave them the answer to and have them struggle for 30 seconds and make you ask the question multiple times. What is yoga in the Gita? Ras.
Practice.
Yes. Specifically what practice?
Practice of not being attached.
Okay.
Not being attached to the result.
It's really important that you say working or doing your duty, because not being attached can, without the idea of doing your duty, is not in line with the Gita's teaching. I just corrected her for her foolish answer, and then you essentially did Atulya too. You're like Atulya's younger sister or something like that, who's less good looking and has all the stupidity and none of the looks. I mean, you're a good looking guy, but not as good looking as Atulya. Sorry, buddy. But you're definitely her equal in terms of temporary stupidity tonight. So at least you guys are like siblings in that regard. I really want to get us here where we can float in and out of these ideas seamlessly. And I need you guys to participate. What's the first teaching of the Gita? Kumi. Boom! Boom! Clean, easy, without any hesitation. It's like when you ask me what's 3 plus 3, 3 plus 3? Like, yeah, 3 plus 3. They're like, well, that would be 3 and 3 together in an addition problem. You're like, yeah, what's the answer? They're like, well, it's definitely not 9. Is it 6? You're like, okay, I failed, and you're in the wrong class. You need to go back to preschool. What's the first teaching of the Gita, Leela? Boom. What does that lead to, Diana? To do your duty without being attached. If we're going to come up with some fancy Sanskrit words, what's the first idea of the Gita in Sanskrit? Sankhya. Boom, Sankhya. And it leads to what? Yoga, also known as? And Buddhi Yoga. The Buddhi in Buddhi Yoga means what, Dalen? That's true, but what does it mean? What's the word Buddhi mean in Sanskrit, in English? Enlightenment. The first answer you gave, I gave to you again, and you still failed. But we got close. That was good. We're almost there. I feel like we're awake. That's good. I feel like we're awake. Now, this idea that you're not the body is an instance, an example of a much larger, more voluminous, more abstract, more powerful, more philosophical concept, which is that there is...
A difference between spirit and matter.
That's right. There's 2 things in the world and they're distinct. And it follows the Misi principle, mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive. If you understand consciousness and matter, you've understood everything that exists in reality. The 2 basic facets of reality. Most of the early chapters of the Gita, almost all of them, are dedicated to fleshing out these concepts in a variety of ways. What to do if you're not detached, but you won't have to do your duty. Ideas like yagya, which are an evolution of doing your duty. What's better if you had to choose between the 2, knowing that you're not the body or doing your duty? What if you don't believe in spirituality? Where does honor come into the equation? What does a person who knows they're not the body look like? How do they move in this world? How to surrender, how to cultivate detachment? What is the obstacle from doing your duty? How to deal with people who are unenlightened when you yourself are enlightened? If there's ever a time when you can retire from doing your duty and receive a higher calling? How are these ideas connected to divinity? How do they lead to divinity? And then Krishna jumps into the idea that he's God for a minute, and then goes right back into this, fleshing out the distinction between duty and action and inaction and forbidden action. Puts it all together into a nice simple formula for us. And that simple formula is text 23, chapter 4, page 209 and 210 in my book. Your page numbers might be a little different. You guys see it? Text 23. Gata sangasya, for one who is not attached to the result. Or excuse me, for one whose attachment has departed. For one whose attachment has departed. Muktasya, for one who's liberated. Jnana avastita cetasa, for one whose mind is situated in knowledge. Yagyaya acharata karma, that person does action for the purpose of enlightenment. Samagram praviliyate, and everything, all of their karma melts away by their acting for the purpose of self-realization. Even though they're in this world, their karma melts away. Even though they're moving in this world, because they're moving for the purpose of self-realization, with their attachment having departed, in a liberated state, situated knowledge, then their actions become non-binding. And as they're moving in this world, they're depleting their karma, not, action and reaction with this endless cycle, but they're disintegrating their karma without acquiring more karma, because they're moving in this world in this Teflon-like way, liberated, unattached, situated knowledge, acting in this world but only for the purpose of higher wisdom. What's brilliant about this verse, and why, even though we covered it last week, we're looking at it again. Look at the verse and the Roman transliteration, which shows you the Sanskrit words in Roman letters, which is the letters the English is written in. You see the word yagyaya. Second line, first word, yagyaya charata. Yagyaya. So we have the word yagna. Then you see the word jnana, first line, second half, jnana avastita cetasaha. You see that? Jnana. Then you see the word karma, yagyaya charata karma. The word karma is there. You see this? So we have here in this verse the idea of jnana or knowledge, the idea of karma or action, and the idea of yagna, action which is done for the purpose of self-realization. All the main ideas of the last 4 chapters, 3.5 chapters, that have oftentimes been dissected and even potentially viewed as distinct. They're put together into one verse. And so we see that it's not that there's 2 paths, the path of jnana and the path of karma, like you might get if you were to read, a college textbook on Hinduism. But you see what the Gita is going for here is a synergistic understanding of the pre-existing Vedic tradition, wherein all these different ideas are put together into what's called a samanvaya, or a conclusion that is able to accommodate all sorts of different, usually disparate ideas which normally compete with one another. Do you guys follow that? You get this sometimes with martial arts. Jiu-jitsu is an amazing martial art for joint locks and strangles. But jiu-jitsu is notoriously bad at takedowns. The reason is because when you practice jiu-jitsu, You become effective from your butt. So when you get into a fight, you can simply drag your opponent to the ground. And if you're on the bottom, it doesn't matter because you can still finish your opponent even from your back. You follow? Therefore, you don't have to work so hard for takedowns because the guy on the bottom can still win. You get it? So jiu-jitsu is phenomenal for joint locks. It's phenomenal for strangles. It's terrible for takedowns. But there's another sport which is really good for takedowns, but which sucks at joint locks and strangles. What's that sport? Who said something? Judo? Judo is actually fantastic for takedowns, it's true. Wrestling is also great for takedowns. In some ways, judo is a dark horse because people don't think of judo as being as effective as wrestling. But especially when you're clinched out from the standing position when strikes are involved, judo works phenomenally well, as does Greco-Roman wrestling, which is the Western equivalent of judo, without the gi to hold on to. So wrestling or judo has these ability to take a fight from a standing position and put it on the ground. But then once the fight gets to the ground, wrestling and judo kind of suck for finishing the fight on the ground. There is something called niwaza, that's the element of judo, which is the groundwork they do. And when a judo fight gets taken to the ground and the guy throws the person on the ground, they do have a moment, just a few moments where they can finish the fight or try to finish the fight. And so it's not that that doesn't exist at all in the sport. And wrestling, the wrestling that we do, folk style wrestling, collegiate wrestling, freestyle wrestling, these are all evolutes or derivations of catch-as-catch-can wrestling, the original wrestling that was popular in England and in the US. And that form of wrestling involved all sorts of fun stuff like eye gouging and fish hooking and striking and no holds barred events where you could, break any limb. And so you do find that within at least the oldest form of wrestling, you do find joint locks were part of it, strangles were part of it. That stuff got taken out when it got sportified. Just as judo is the sportification of jiu-jitsu, it was then re-streetified in Brazil, and that's why Brazilian jiu-jitsu is the re-streetification of jiu-jitsu, which had been sportified so it could become judo and become a practicable sport, just as wrestling is the sportification in various forms, freestyle, Greco-Roman, folk style, and collegiate, of a pre-existing tradition which involves a lot more stuff. That was all just interesting, fun facts, because a bunch of us wrestle, do jiu-jitsu, you guys appreciate it. But it does make the point, I don't even know the point I was trying to make, I do know the point. So a lot of times you break things down into different schools, and there's value in that. You're going to study history, you're going to study English, you're going to study math. We're taught to study like that. But there's also something beautiful about showing how all those things work together. That's also a specialization in and of itself. And you find that, if you look at the way jiu-jitsu is being done now, jiu-jitsu athletes are on steroids. At least they're on testosterone. At the highest level, everyone's on testosterone. You can see it. I mean, maybe some of the really light guys aren't on it, but everybody, let's say, 185 pounds and above, who's at the top level of the sport, they're all on steroids. Because it gives you an advantage. They're all also in phenomenal shape, like cardio for days. Because that also gives you an advantage. If you can go fast in a transition and not take your foot off the brakes and never concede anything and keep just upping the energy output, then an opponent who's less aerobically adept will have to eventually slow down and concede the position because they just can't keep up with the scramble forever. You get going too fast for them. And so nowadays, jiu-jitsu athletes are on testosterone, lifting weights in phenomenal aerobic shape. And they all study wrestling. All of them. And or judo. At the highest levels. Because it gives them an advantage. Especially in mixed martial arts, where if you're on top, you can punch the guy. Then it's like, then the less skilled person on top has a very decided advantage, namely gravity. They can punch with a lot of gravity behind their punches. The other person can't get much off because they're laying on the ground, which stops you from really getting momentum going. But the person who's on top can reach back and then rain down and just get like incredible amounts of kinetic energy along with gravity. But the guy on the bottom was trying to hit up. He's stifled. It's like little short rabbit punches. So at the highest level of something, you have to be able to take different ideas and mix them together without just mushing them. You have to be able to piece it all together. Perhaps in the world of combat, there is no way in which this is done better than in boxing. I mean, they only got hands, so they're not dealing with the legs and takedowns and stuff. But when you see that, the speed and the reaction time and the ability to slip and make the other person miss and take angles and just if you really watch boxing, you have to slow it down because it's so fast you can't even see what they did. I'm always amazed by commentators and how they're able to keep up with it, because I ended up always just pausing and going back and looking to see the move and what they did and how they slipped and like where their foot placement was and how they shifted their weight and suckered the other person in. It's astounding. It's like ballet with very, very high stakes. Ballet with really high stakes. It's beautiful. They call it the sweet science for a reason. It's beautiful watching boxers, just like true boxers in their element and just the speed they operate with. Jiu-jitsu, because it involves grabbing hold of your opponent, one opponent can slow the action down. In boxing, it's very difficult to slow the action down. I mean, there are ways to do it. You can clinch up in boxing as well. There's all sorts of stuff you can do. But the ref's job is to stop that from happening. You get to see people just always just on fire in terms of speed. So there is something beautiful about breaking it down, but ultimately we need to live our life, which means we need to take ideas and action and we need to put them together into a holistic package that we can then go out into the world and act in the world in an enlightened way and not forget everything we learn and not hesitate, but do our duty and be detached and remember our lessons and use them in a real practical way and not leave it on paper, but actually make it holistic and synergistic and go out there. And you see in the pages of the Gita, Krishna beginning to at least verbally give you that on paper, where instead of breaking things into different categories, he's now giving individual verses that have all of the major elements in them, such as karma, yajna, and jnana. Not that those words don't deserve treatment on their own. Not that Krishna doesn't treat them on their own, but that as he told. Did you guys follow that? There's something beautiful, and merge them together and show how they're really not at odds with one another. How they're really not at odds with one another. Used to be that, wrestling had these just critical features that a jiu-jitsu player could always exploit. But now, when you have people who are trained in both, they're able to wrestle without exposing themselves to, just easy submissions. They don't make those easy mistakes anymore. They put it together, and now you go into a class and you learn wrestling, which is just what do I want to say? It's distilled and systematized in a way to make it streamlined and effective in a jiu-jitsu tournament. And the people who can do that always have an advantage. Similarly in life, when you can, Actually, it's funny, but usually the way a jiu-jitsu class goes is this: the teacher will teach a technique, and then you will drill the technique, and then you will spar. And if the teacher's really good, he'll force you to spar in positions where that technique is going to come up. So he'll give you a limited sparring session where you have to be in a position where that technique is a viable alternative. If you get a really sophisticated teacher, he'll teach you the technique and then an early version of it, an on-time version of it, and a late version of it. But there was an old Japanese way of teaching Shudo, which is a form of submission wrestling that did not just come out of Brazil. It was a reflection of catch-as-catch-can wrestling. And it was taught in Japan. And the way Shudo would be taught was they would teach you every day 20 submissions in order as you went over the person's body from position to position. So you'd be in the person's guard, and they would teach you a guard pass into side control. You'd submit the person from side control 3-4 different ways. Move to head mount, submit the person again. Move to a full mount position, submit the person again. Take the person's back, submit the person a couple times again. And it would be 20 moves you'd teach. And I always thought that my teacher, who taught this system along with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was insane. I thought he had ADHD, which I think he did. He did. And he was a very, very well-known professional athlete. I think he did have ADHD and still does. And it was always insane because he'd want to teach 15, 20 moves in a class. He got like a 30, 45-minute session. He's teaching you 20 moves, each move for 2 minutes. And he's just moving so fast, you can't even follow him. And he's and I one time I asked him, I go, it seems insane. Like you're mentally disturbed. There's something wrong with you. And none of us can follow what you're doing. And it's awful. And he explained to me, he goes, no, I do this on purpose. This is how they taught in Shudo. He's the one who explained this to me. He said, we teach the same moves for 3 or 6 months, the same 20 moves every day. And around the 2, 3, 4 month period, all of a sudden you learn how to do them in real life situations as you're floating over somebody in transitions, because that's the way the moves occur in real life. And so instead of teaching them static and then you having to figure out on your own how to string them together, we teach them to you strung together so you'll see the opportunities in real time, and we're teaching you in motion. Then I thought, oh my God, you're brilliant. And like, where have you been all my life? Like, wow. And it actually works. You learn chains of submissions, chains of moves. And then anytime you drop into that chain, you know where to back up to, where to go ahead, if you're early or late, because you know what came before it, what came after, and all that stuff is accomplished. And so there's great value in learning. And there's a lot of things you just can't learn statically. Basketball plays, and double leg takedowns. You ultimately have to put it all together. There's a momentum factor. You have to do complicated lifts, Olympic lifts. All require this. Like it's a chain of lifts. It's a chain of lifts strung together. Like a clean and jerk. Like what's involved in a clean and jerk, right? It's a deadlift into a clean, which is that upright row, into a transition where you and then it's squat is there as well. You got to get under it. So it's bizarre. You deadlift, like a monster deadlift, then roll right into a front squat, right? And the monster deadlift mixes with a hang clean or a full clean, and then it mixes into the squat. Then you finally finish that, and that's not even it. And then you do a military press, but like a push press where you can really use your momentum into a split stance, and then you bring your split stance back together again. It's ridiculous the amount of weight people can lift like this. It's mind-boggling the amount of weight they can lift because they start this chain and they're able to, and they're complicated lifts, and they're complicated enough that you got to practice them with sticks. You know, even, like, they don't have you using weights in the beginning. They give you a broomstick. You're just using that because, I mean, it's not. They have actual things that are like broomsticks. But you practice the technique because the technique is so critical to the lift. And then you get something like CrossFit, where in the beginning they just tortured you through these lifts, and people got injured so badly. Then they finally got actual Olympic lifting coaches to come in, and then it's become a legitimate form of exercise. But prior to that, you'd watch CrossFitters doing these Olympic style lifts, and they were just, it was just basically just have an ambulance company and park next to the CrossFit box and just wait for people to get injured. There are many things in life like this, and in fact, life is like this. Marriage is like this. Your career is like this. Going to school is like this. Having relationships is like this. Working on your integrity is like this. It's all done in motion. And so this idea that you maybe can't appreciate unless you've been studying with me for months right now, of how Gyan and Karma and Yajna, the concepts we've been dealing with the whole time, are now put together in a compound movement. It's a thing of beauty. No less beautiful than any of the stuff I just described. More beautiful. More amazing. More complex. More compounded. More exciting. Doing your duty and being informed by knowledge and doing it for a higher purpose, and how that actually frees you from reaction and melts away, dissolves your attachment to this world. How it all comes together synergistically. Did you guys follow that? Now we're warmed up to look at today's verse. And you guys are going to see why all of this was important to get you guys to where we could look at this verse. Text 24. Brahma arpanam, Brahma havir, Brahmagnau, Brahmanahutam, Brahmaiva tena gantavyam, Brahma karma samadhina. Brahmarpanam. You guys notice anything about the verse? Brahmarpanam. Right? Brahmahavi. Right? Brahmagnau, Brahmanahutam, Brahmaiva tena gantavyam, Brahma karma samadhina. You guys notice anything about the verse? What'd you notice?
Brahma 6 times.
The word Brahma is used 6 times in a verse that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. The verse has 14 words, 6 of which are Brahman. Have you ever seen a verse that uses the same word this many times in the Gita? Is there any other verse in the Gita that uses the same word this many times? No. This verse is a singularity in the Gita. There are verses like this in Vedic literatures. There are verses like this in Vedic literatures, in poetry, in different Vedic texts. But in the Gita, this is the only verse like this. Brahmarpanam. The offering is Brahman. Brahmahavi. Again, the offering is Brahman. Havi and Arpana are largely synonyms in the Sanskrit language. Arpana means offering, and Havi means also offering. Havis in Sanskrit usually refers to cakes made out of rice and grain soaked in milk and sometimes mixed with fruits and nuts. The classic havis, there's many types of havis, but the classic one is payas. Payas is sweet rice, which is rice, grain, mixed with milk. And so that's oftentimes you physically offer the sweet rice into the sacrificial fire. Or sometimes you're supposed to drink it afterwards, and you offer it and then you drink it afterwards. And so this idea of havis is an old Vedic idea linked to the Vedic concept of yajna. Yajna, again, briefly, is the idea that God created the world and gave you the ability to give back. And the primary things God gave you are sun and water and air. Sun for photosynthesis and heat and light, water to nourish you, and air to breathe. And so then you ritually offer those items back. How do you do that? Well, rain comes and makes grass grow. Cows eat grass, they make milk. You take the milk and essentialize it several times into cream and butter and then into ghee, clarified butter. You then offer that ghee, which represents what ingredient? Rain, the water that came down and nourished you. The rain came down, grew the grass, was eaten by a cow. Cow gave milk, something you could never do on your own. And then you take that milk, essentialize it twice into cream, into butter, 3 times into ghee. Now you have clarified butter, which represents crystallized water. And you offer that into the fire along with mantra, and the mantra represents air and the fire represents the sun. And now you're offering ritually back to God the things that he offered to you. That is yajna. And so that old Vedic rite was done by people. It was a deep practice, but it eventually became so systematized that it became sportified. And it kind of lost its heart. Buddha complains about this in the Dhammapada and in many Buddhist texts. Buddha complains about this. Buddha was a revolutionary who sort of threw out the Vedic culture. In fact, the last chapter of the Dhammapada is who is a Brahmin. Who is a Brahmin? Brahmin, we'll get into the etymology of the term, but a Brahmin essentially means priest. And Buddha was arguing, who's a real priest? Oh, you guys think you're Brahmins? No, we're the real Brahmins. Like imagine if, a Christian wrote a book called Who's the Real Jew? He's criticizing the Judaic tradition. That the Christians are the real Jews. We understand your teachings better than you do. So that kind of challenge was being made by the Buddha. And so the Vedic culture eventually became so sportified and so detailed and so ritualistic that the ritual lost its heart and it just became mere repetition and fancy moves without the heart, without the grit, without the philosophy behind it. And so that Vedic culture is the background of the Gita. And Krishna's doing something beautiful here. He's taking that Vedic culture and he's merging it with the philosophical ideas and spiritual ideas he's been talking about. Namely Brahman. The word Brahman comes from Bri. Bri means to grow. Brahman is that thing from which everything came. The Brahma Sutras start off Atato Brahma Jigyasa Jamadi Yasya Yataha. That Brahman is that thing from which everything came. So Brahman is that thing from which everything came. Brahman is defined like that. So Brahman is that thing from which everything came, ergo Brahman is God, the source of all reality. In fact, the word Brahman is used as a synonym for God. The word Brahman is also used for the Vedic texts. The term Brahman is also used for a spiritual state of mind. So you find the word Brahman used in a variety of contexts within the Gita. Depending on the context, it's a multivalent word, it means different things, but it always means spiritual. And so probably the cleanest translation here is that Brahman means spiritual. So what Krishna is saying here is the offering is Brahman. Now, we could do, the offering, the arpanas, whatever thing you might be offering into the fire, the various types of offerings you would make. At one point, the Vedic culture did animal sacrifices, but they also did other sacrifices where grains and ghee were being offered. So although these words are largely synonymous, you could say the arpana could be referring to one of the sacrificial ingredients that was offered. Havi sometimes means ghee. So it could be like the physical offering of the cakes could be arpana. The havi could be the ghee, or you could switch it. There's different ways to view it. But the offering is Brahman. The ghee is Brahman. The offering is spiritual. The ghee that the offering is made with is also spiritual. Brahmagnau, it's offered into the fire, which is also spiritual. Brahmanahutam, by the priest who's also spiritual. Brahmaivatena gantavyam. By that, Brahman is to be obtained. Gerund Brahman is to be attained. It is that thing which is to be attained by this act. So Brahman is the ghee. Brahman is the rice. Our example would be ghee and rice. Brahman is the ghee. Brahman is the rice. It's offered into the fire, which is Brahman, by the priest who's Brahman. And then Brahman will be attained by that person who is absorbed in Brahman. Brahma karma samadhina means by that person who's absorbed in Brahma karma. And so what you have here is the old Vedic rite and spirituality being merged with the old Vedic rite, which normally had lost its heart and become conceived of as this very, very mechanistic thing. And now it's being restored, and with the proper consciousness, when you engage in that old ritual is a moving meditation. It got its heart back. The purpose behind it remains, and it's still there, and you can connect with something much higher by going through this old ritual. The old ritual is actually a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual affair. And it's not a material thing, although it was criticized as being a material thing. And although people saw it as being very mechanistic and very ritualistic. In fact, there was a heart or a special purpose or some kind of deep spirituality behind it. And so you can go back and reapproach that thing that you thought had become material with fresh eyes, and you can see how actually it will help you in your spiritual life, how nothing needs to be rejected, how everything can be viewed as contributing to and part of a healthy, synergistic, complete, holistic spiritual worldview. Do you guys follow that? Brahman is the offering. Brahman is the ghee. It's offered in the fire of Brahman by the priest who's Brahman. And Brahman will be attained by that person who's absorbed in Brahman. And Brahman here means what? Juanita? Spirit. That's a problem that you didn't know that. Brahman here means spirit. It can mean a lot of different things, but in this case, the easiest way for us to cut our teeth on this verse is to say Brahman means spirit. And so what we have here is Krishna mentioned yajna and karma and jnana coming together, but now he's merging this whole thing and the old Vedic rites with these spiritual ideas of being in this world but not of it, of doing your duty but not being attached, of being able to live in this world but not become attached by it, of being able to do your duty but actually becoming transcendental as a result of working in this world instead of materially attached, of being able to glide through this world. And he's showing how that teaching applies to the Vedic rite, and eventually to go on and show how it applies to everything. But he starts by revisiting the old Vedic rite of his tradition and looking at it through fresh eyes, through the spiritual eyes of how everything can become spiritual and everything ultimately is spiritual and everything can help you move forward in your spiritual life. Brahmarpanam, Brahmahavi, Brahmagnau, Brahmanahutam, Brahmatenaiva gantavyam, Brahmakarma samadhina. Brahman is the offering. Brahman is the ghee offered in the fire of Brahman by the priest who's Brahman. Brahman will be attained by that person who's absorbed in Brahman. And Brahman here means what, Juanita? Bingo. Now just saying spirit, 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 spirit is difficult. So listen to Prabhupada's translation. A person who is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness, that's the Brahma Karma Samadhina, is sure to attain the spiritual kingdom. That's he'll attain Brahman. Because of his full, that's Brahmatena Gantavyam. Because of its full contribution, there's the Brahma Arpanam to spiritual activities, in which the consummation is absolute. There's the Brahmanahavi, that's Brahmagnau, and that which is offered is of the same spiritual nature, that's Brahmahavi. And so Prabhupada takes the verse and he tries to give it teeth by looking at it contextually in a way that is more able to be appreciated. When it says you'll attain Brahma, what does it mean? It means you go back to spirit. When it says it's offered by Brahman, what does it mean? It means that person's fully absorbed in spirituality. When it says the offering is Brahman, what does it mean? It means that the consummation, the fire is Brahman, the offering is Brahman. Prabhupada uses this kind of poetic language to turn this idea, which would be almost koanic or very enigmatic or purposefully abstruse, and he makes it more easy to appreciate in the life of a devotee. We could extend this and we could say, you are Brahman, your wife is Brahman, your children is Brahman, your job at SpaceX is Brahman, your captainship or majorship in the U.S. Army is also Brahman. The car you drove in here is Brahman. And if you have that consciousness, then instead of your material life degrading you, you'll find your material life is an impetus for your spiritual life. It's difficult to appreciate what's being done here if you don't have some background in the Vedic rites, in the Sanskrit language, in the old world culture. If you have an appreciation of the old world culture, then this verse is just like revolutionary. I tried to give you something you could relate to, where it's your school is spiritual, your family is spiritual, your aspirations are spiritual. It can all be brought into unison in some kind of harmonic convergence. But the problem here is, although all of you may understand that, it lacks an element, and that element is that we're talking about something that you've been learning for your entire life, some kind of old rite that you've been learning for your entire for your entire life. This idea of this old concept that's been with you, that digs deep. Like, I don't even know what that is. We don't even have that in the U.S. We'd be better off if you were from Mexico or something like that. And we could talk about, some old world concept from Russia or some old world culture. Or Jewish. We could, it's like we could say, the holy days are spiritual, and the rabbi is spiritual. And the matzah is also spiritual. You know what I mean? And and the stories you hear are also spiritual. And all the rituals you learn, even the latkes are spiritual, and the dreidels are spiritual, and the menorah is spiritual when it's offered in a proper way, in a proper mindset. You can appreciate it more because you were raised with these ancient rites that have been preserved and kept alive, that are seen as just rites in their own accord, and they lack some of that revolutionary quality because you learn them from the very beginning, and so they seem old and monolithic and fixed and in some ways more material, and you don't view them as being this radical spiritual offering which was being made because you learned it from your very early, and the old people are doing it, and it seems hackneyed and dated to some extent. Are you guys following this? You have to look at something you thought was like dated and old. You learn from the very beginning, and you just ceased to appreciate it, and you didn't see it, and then somebody showed it to you with fresh eyes, and all of a sudden you realize, oh wow, this has always been beautiful. It's always been spiritual. I just learned it wrong. I could go back and learn it right, and it's so beautiful and so complete. Like if you learned how to cook meat, and then you became a devotee and you wanted to cook vegetarian, and somebody was able to show you how all the things you learned with cooking meat could still be used when cooking vegetarian food. Or something you saw that it didn't make sense to you, and you thought you had to leave it behind, and it was useless to you, and then somebody showed you how actually it was always beautiful, and you just misunderstood it the whole time. And it came together in perfect harmony. You know what it would be like? You know what it would be like? It's the equivalent of if you spent your whole life struggling and suffering and looking at things in your life as being causes of your pain. Your parents were a source of pain. And your school years were a source of pain. And your mistakes were a source of pain, and people had caused you pain, and people were to be blamed for what you've been through. How many of you can relate to this? Every single one of you. If you're not raising your hand, you're a liar. And so you're blaming people, and you're seeing it as being a negative, and you've got some resentment built up. How many of you have resentment built up? Every single one of you. If you don't raise your hand, you're a liar. And then imagine you woke up one day, and all those people, your parents, your teachers, all those people you blamed as being the source of your suffering, showed you how they always had your best interest at heart. And how behind the scenes they were always working for your benefit. And all the mistakes you made were actually your mistakes. And they showed you. And how they had set you up for a much better life. And how every moment, and it really, the only person who could come and have this conversation with you is God, because I'm starting to talk about an omnipotent, omniscient being. But then he came to you and he showed you how the entire time I've been looking out for you. Every opportunity you thought was stacked against you was actually stacked for you. Every time you thought you got a rough deal, you actually deserved way worse. I've minimized what you deserved. Let me show you what you did to deserve much worse in this lifetime and a past lifetime. And I minimized it all. At every moment I was spoon feeding you and you were slapping me. Remember when you said this, you thought that I made myself small to give you more space, but I never left. I was always there, ready to help. I never gave up on you. Never stopped wishing you well, never left you. I was just hidden in your heart, invisible, because you didn't want to see me. And you were able to see that. You were able to see how your life was entirely caused by you. And at every moment, the Lord had been blessing you and looking after you and helping you. And all the things you thought were against you were actually designed for you, and you just had misunderstood them and messed them up. Imagine waking up one day and seeing that. That's the kind of feeling you get from reading this verse. The ancient tradition, which in many ways was seen as being materialistic or hackneyed or archaic or dead or materialistic or ritualistic, is now breathed back to life. And its ultimate purpose is revealed in beautiful, elegant Sanskrit poetry. And all the things you thought you had to move away from, it turns out they're the best of things. And they're beautiful things. And you just misunderstood them the whole time. And then you wake up and you realize, and you can see it all clearly, how you messed up and the whole thing was caused by you. And how the Lord has always been blessing you and helping you and looking out for you and has always been your friend. That's the kind of feeling you get when you look at the verse. Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you. You guys want to give me some feedback?